David, we're coming close to the end of Romans here. And for the last session, we were involved in an analysis or conversation about Paul's exhortations, the paranetic section in chapters 12 and 13. And we saw the importance of the love command.
Yeah.
We worried a little bit about the eschatological or end-time horizon within which Paul thinks, worrying a little bit about how vital it is at this point in his career, and it's certainly there in some form or other. The exhortation continues in the second half of this ring composition
Right.
with chapter 14. Can you tell us what's going on there?
I can give you my best guess. First of all, I just affirm what you say, that this, I think, is further spelling out of how the love commandment works now, not in relation to authorities and not in relation to enemies, both of which we've had, but how does it work out in the life of the community. And I must say, in the years that I've been studying Romans, which is now quite a few, I've gone back and forth puzzling whether this represents Paul's knowledge of particular issues within the Roman church, or whether he's kind of taking the principles he came up with in 1 Corinthians and applying them on the assumption that they always work. In 1 Corinthians, it's I think, fairly clear that some of the Corinthian Christians feel it's perfectly appropriate to eat meat that's been offered to idols in temple worship and then sold on the market, and they eat it unhesitatingly. Other Christians think that since it's been involved, other believers think that since it's been involved in idolatry, it is idolatrous to eat it. And Paul is trying to find a way to negotiate between those two sets of Christians. And a quick aside on that, in both cases, when I'm a Baptist, and growing up we always thought strong Christians were the don't do this, don't do that. Don't drink alcohol, don't dance, don't play cards, don't go to the movies on Sunday. For Paul, those are the weak Christians, interestingly. Those are the ones who have all kinds of stipulations to go with their faith. The strong Christians are those who trust enough in the grace of God and their own fidelity that they don't have to get up with a list of the do-nots every morning. So it's a reversal of the way we usually think of strong and weak Christianity. So whether out of something he knows about the Roman churches or whether out of his life with the churches in Corinth, he's saying in some ways the same thing, that those of you who are strong Christians, who are not worried by scruples about what you eat, for example, should not cause those who are weak Christians to stumble by your behavior. So that, of course, you're free to do all these things, but don't use your freedom to hurt your brother or sister.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, I think you're quite right in all of that. I think the situation is probably a little bit different from what's going on in Corinth. Paul seems to allude to some issue about vegetarianism
yep.
in verse 2, and
Yep.
that one could construe that as a way of abiding by kashrut.
That I have played that card with
so
that.
So it's possible that it's analogous
Speaking of
to
Baptist things, I played that card.
Or it could be some other form of vegetarianism.
It could, which
works
beautifully
popular
in Berkeley, where I was once a pastor.
and we know it was popular in some Roman circles, Gentile circles. But there's something else that's going on here that suggests it might be a Jewish Gentile thing. That is the observance of certain
That's what I've
days
wondered, yeah.
in verse 6.
Yeah.
So it may be that some people are keeping Shabbat and some people not, and that might be dividing the community a little bit. So Paul knows that there are these issues, but they don't seem to be at the focal point of his attention as the weak, strong divide in Corinth was.
They don't. It does become a way of circling back around to 9 and 11. Mm-hmm. If chapters 9 to 11 are about what happens to Jews and to Gentiles in the larger world, then maybe 13 and 14, especially 14, are about what happened to Jewish believers and Gentile believers in the Roman community. And I really do go by. My teacher, Paul Minear, thought this was very much like Corinthians, that you could designate a weak party and a strong party, and I'm less convinced of that.
Mm-hmm. I think in some ways the issue of vegetarianism, or whatever it is that Paul is addressing, is simply a jumping off point for the larger admonition that he wants to deliver in verse 7, which is cycling back to his theme of participation in Christ and Christ living in us. We do not live to ourselves. We do not die to ourselves. If we live to the Lord, and if we die to the Lord. So then, whether we live or whether we die, we are the Lord's. So the relationship to Christ.
It's the text I use most often when I'm preaching funerals. And when I'm not preaching funerals, but just doing Bible study, I point out that so often with Paul, what looks like the most mundane thing, what are we going to do with vegetarians in church, turns into the most astonishing theological affirmations, so that he's the very best of what a practical theologian should be. We sometimes think a practical theologian is the one who tells you to wash your hands before you go into the hospital room, or don't pray for longer than a minute and a half, because that wears out the patient. But the practical theologian is the one who says, when you walk into the hospital room, remember, if we live to the Lord, we live. If we live, we live to the Lord. If we die, we die to the Lord. It's the person who brings the whole power of the Christian story to bear on the immediate story. And I think that's what Paul does most powerfully.
And still doesn't lose sight of the immediate and the
And
practical.
doesn't lose sight of the immediate.
Which
It's not simply abstract.
Right, which he'll go on to emphasize in the latter part of that chapter.
He does indeed.
Yeah. So this whole section in chapter 14 is dealing with that kind of issue. And then Paul provides us a kind of summation of his argument overall in chapter 15, right? In two parts. The first several verses emphasizing the ethical, and then in what's going on in chapter 15, verse 7.
Well, then here is my ongoing kind of pedantic puzzle, which doesn't change much about the way you read the text. In the days when I was most convinced that this was written out of the particular situation of Jewish Christians having had to leave under Claudius and returning under Nero, I thought that the line is, welcome one another, therefore, as Christ has welcomed you, for the glory of God, that specific advice, you Gentile Christians who have had the rule of the roost while the Jewish Christians were in exile, now welcome them back as Christ has welcomed you, and becomes, therefore, a kind of summation of the practical implications of the whole gospel. I don't rule that out. What I rule in is that this is one more claim that Paul makes all the way through, which is that the gospel is for Jews and Gentiles alike, and therefore no Jew should boast in his or her Jewishness, and no Gentile in his or her Gentileness, but that all of us rest on the mercy of God. And in the light of that mercy, we are, as the saying says, every believing community is a welcoming community, because we have ourselves been welcomed. Every community is a graced community because we have ourselves been graced. Every community is a loving community because we have ourselves been loved.
I like that a lot. It's interesting to think about how the rhetoric of this chapter would work given different situations, right? If he's addressing just Gentiles, welcoming Jews,
Right.
or addressing a mixed community and reminding them both
Both
of
sides.
their obligations
Yeah.
and responsibilities and principles on which they have to live. And I see it working in somewhat that way. In the scriptural quotations of verses 9 through 12. On the one side, he's affirming that Gentiles are part of this reality.
Absolutely, yeah.
So there may be folk out there who want to deny that in some way.
have not yet brought that in.
Therefore, I will confess you among the Gentiles,
Yeah.
and will sing praises to your name. And at the same time, everyone, Jew and Gentile, has to recognize the focal point of their allegiance in this
Yeah,
new
I like that.
reality. And that's given in the quote from Isaiah in verse 12. The root of Jesse shall come,
That's nice.
the one who rises to rule the Gentiles. In him the Gentiles shall
Yeah,
hope.
I like that.
So, there's a focus
It's a
on
both
place.
and.
Yeah.
I think I have to go back and rewrite that article, but nicely done. Yeah.
In any case, it's a marvelous section, and it concludes with another doxology, or another prayer, actually.
Yeah.
May the God of hope fill you with all joy and peace in believing, so that you may abound in hope by the power of the Holy Spirit. So that in some ways seems to conclude the argumentative section of Romans.
It does indeed.
And then in chapter 15, verse 14 and following, we have Paul talking about his own situation. Anything?
Well,
that we
I
can
think it
take out of that?
circles back around to the way our conversation started. Why does he write this letter? Why does he feel the need to introduce himself to these people? And a large part of this is to share with them his itinerary, which is that he's on his way to Spain eventually. He wants them to welcome him. I assume that means, though it does go back to welcome one another, P.S. also welcome me. It's probably not a stupid way to tie those two things together in his mind. But also his hope that they will be partners in his spreading of the gospel. And one of the things we talked about briefly in looking at chapters 9 to 11 is, I think his hope that within his own lifetime and his own ministry, the gospel will be preached to the Gentiles from one end of the empire to the other. And Spain's the farthest west he's going to go. And I think he thinks he needs to get there before he dies, or is taken up to be with Christ, and he wants to engage them as part of that ministry. And in that sense, they become part of that great moment where the Gentiles all come in, and then the Jews, somewhat ashamed, come in afterwards.
Yeah, I certainly think he has hopes for his Spanish mission, and we don't know whether
We don't know if he did
ever
it.
really-
We don't know.
There's a report later on in the first century that he did go to
Yeah,
Spain.
yeah.
And then came back to Rome to be
Right, and we just don't
executed.
know.
But no actual reports
Right.
of his
Right.
activity there. So we have these travel plans that tell us a lot about his situation in writing the text. And then in chapter 16, we have what seems to be just a long list
Yeah,
of names
huge
of
list.
people that he's greeting.
Huge list.
Is there anything of interest in that long list of
Well,
names?
a couple things. One, it's a long list of names. And so how does he have this extraordinarily long list of names to a church where he's never been? Some have thought, partly for that reason, partly for funny textual reasons, that this is an add-on later than the letter. I like to keep it in there for kind of theological and practical readings. And it may be that the list is very long because if I, Paul, am commending myself to you, the leader of the Roman Church, one way to do it is to list all the friends we have in common. I know Prisca and Aquila, I know the following 4 people, so they'll vouch for me. This is a way of saying, not only am I a good guy, but I've got friends in your court already.
Who are Prisca and Aquila?
They are people who have been part of his community earlier on, and we find them in Acts, and they seem to have themselves traveled from Corinth back here, and they were, I think, according to Acts, among those kicked out during the Claudius exclusion. Is that not right?
That's right, Acts
kind
18.
Kind of fits Bartlett's little, now perhaps dying theory
Yeah.
of the reason for this letter being written in the first place.
And
Yep.
they were apparently with Paul when he wrote 1
And
Corinthians.
it's fairly worth
Yeah.
Paul when he wrote 1
Yeah.
Corinthians. So that they are major players in his life. The other piece is the nice mix between men and women, nice mix between names that seem to be Jewish and names that seem to be Gentile. And for those of us who worry about women's ordination, long before there was a question of ordination per se, we've got chapter 16, verse 7. I commend to you our sister Phoebe, a deacon. For years that was translated as deaconess, but it's
That's
in fact
verse 1, you mean?
verse 1,
Yeah.
16 verse 1, sorry. I commend to you our sister Phoebe, a deacon of the church at Kencry. That means whatever the other deacons are, including Paul sometimes. She's a diakonos, she's a deacon, she's a minister.
That may not be an official title for.
Oh, it may not
yeah.
be. No, it may not be at all for either of them.
Right.
It's a way of saying that the distinctions we tend to make so wholeheartedly in the 21st century church between male and female and between officer and non-officer may not have functioned for him. And then the trickiest of all is verse 7. Greet Andronicus and Junia, a woman, my relatives who are in prison with me. Relatives presume fellow Jews, I think. They are prominent among the apostles. So is Junia among the apostles, or does it just mean among the apostles they speak well of Junia? You get the same kind of ambiguity about a woman who clearly, as woman, is very important in the life of the early church.
Yeah, I very much think she was an apostle,
Good.
given Paul's sense of
Yeah,
what
I
an
do too.
apostle
I
is.
do
It's
too.
not limited to the 12.
Exactly.
It's someone who has been sent by
Exactly, one who
some
is sent
sort
by
of,
God as a gospel
spiritual
bringer.
experience
Yeah,
of Christ.
Agreed.
So I think Junior is up there with other apostles. So yeah, I think we learn a good deal about the shape of the Roman community or Paul's circles from these names.
I think we do too.
Whether they're in Rome or in Ephesus, those seem to be
yeah.
the major options here, and I share your hunch that they probably are in Rome.
Yeah.
But they've also been traveling around. as we
Exactly.
can tell
It's a peripatetic community from the beginning, which explains why we've got letters to all kinds of places still preserved and why we have a church.
And isn't it great that we have this letter from Paul?
And this is a letter to whom I pledge my allegiance.